Ждем великой победы! Ура!
Never think that war, no matter how necessary, nor how justified, is not a crime, said Ernest Hemingway. But why are we saying this now? You'll find out soon. As the conflict between Russia and Ukraine intensifies, the United States and NATO have been accused of exploiting the situation for their own political and economic gain. While the war in Ukraine has already taken a devastating toll on human life, the added pressures of food and economic crisis have only made the situation worse. With each day passing, the reality is getting more prominent that it's more about an ego fight and less about defending Ukraine. In this video, we will explore the ways in which US and NATO involvement has contributed to the ongoing suffering in Ukraine, and discuss the urgent need for a more ethical and sustainable approach to international conflict. The Ukraine war has caused significant damage, both in terms of collateral damage and its impact on the Ukrainian homeland. However, over the 1 year, the war has now transformed into a clash of egos between the two presidents primarily, both passing off their own nationalism and power dynamics. The recent threat made by Russian President Vladimir Putin of using an unspecified weapon of the ultimate kind against the Western powers is extremely alarming. Putin's statement has sparked concerns worldwide, especially given that Russia holds one of the world's largest arsenals of nuclear weapons, evoking a fear of World War III. Experts are unsure whether this is a serious warning or simply diplomatic brinkmanship. Regardless, the potential use of weapons of mass destruction in the conflict is a serious concern and must be avoided at all costs. It is imperative that the leadership of Ukraine realizes the significance of the damage caused by the conflict and takes steps to de-escalate the situation. But it's the US and US-led NATO pushing the war, gaslighting Russia. In April of last year, a prospective agreement between Russia and Ukraine regarding non-membership in NATO had been on the table. However, Ukraine's Western allies, notably Boris Johnson and Joe Biden, had instigated the further conflict. Regrettably, the outcome was nothing short of catastrophic. 6 major cities were decimated, 4 provinces were annexed, and an alarming $120 billion was expended, which will eventually need to be repaid by Ukraine. Despite these dire circumstances, the US-led NATO paradoxically branded this outcome as a victory. The US has reversed its decision to withhold military aid to Ukraine and impose severe economic sanctions on Russia, despite Biden's previous reluctance to escalate the situation. The Russian foreign minister has warned that the conflict is turning into a third world war, and Putin and his government may feel backed into a corner with few options to save face. But instead of this kind of subtle gaslighting, US President Joe Biden and Russian President Vladimir Putin should be on speaking terms to avoid further escalation. The era of dual superpowers has been replaced by one of the lone superpowers, and Putin's Russia, seeking to be respected as a superpower, may feel threatened by the West's support for Ukraine. It's visible that the US is fighting Russia, but indirectly. The whole scenario looks like a war between the US and US-led NATO and Russia, where the US has set a puppet against Russia to pull the trigger so that the US hands don't get dirty. As the conflict intensifies, the flow of advanced weaponry from the US, UK, and NATO to the battlefield persists, while Russia is mobilizing additional personnel for special military operations. These developments have led the US and its NATO allies to incite public opinion, generate controversy, and arm their proxies, all in an effort to bolster NATO's reinvigoration and maintain its dominant position over Russia. That's why the West now wants Ukraine to win, because Russia has always been an adversary of the West. Moreover, Ukraine got a more sellable, mournful story of loss and devastation now. The US-led NATO is still vouching for the war to implement Ukraine's triumph prominently, even at the cost of a global economic crisis, food and energy crisis, and huge casualties in Ukraine. This way, Russia will be demolished as a superpower, which is a dream come true for the US-led NATO. Also, the West will pose as a savior backed by a great sob story of Ukraine. This pursuit of hegemony by the US has transformed the narrative of peace and development into an illusory tool for promoting its own interests. Over the past 30 years, humanity has not enjoyed real peace and tranquility as ongoing conflicts and crises continue to plague the world. In geopolitical confrontations, the US has armed and privatized the global financial system to cope with adversarial nations and non-state entities. The US and the West have even labeled certain countries with derogatory names such as Evil Empire, Axis of Evil, Rogue State, and Failed State, indicating their discriminatory attitudes toward other nations. In the case of the Russia-Ukraine conflict, some Western politicians have characterized it as a clash between democracy versus autocracy, but that's just a disorienting thought. Not only the US, but other NATO countries like Germany, Italy, and France are also pushing the war for an ego boost and their own benefits. Prime Minister Boris Johnson has attempted to use the conflict in Ukraine to justify his continued tenure as Prime Minister, despite his blatant disregard for the law. He has suggested that it would be wrong to remove a British Prime Minister while Ukraine is in a state of crisis. This argument, however, is misguided and ill-informed. Johnson's assertion that he must remain in office to support Ukraine is a transparent attempt to cover up his own misconduct and to manipulate the desperate plight of Ukraine's people to bolster his own position. This demonstrates a lack of understanding of the British system of government and its long history of peaceful transitions of power. Moreover, this argument makes fools of those who followed COVID instructions to the letter and uses the desperate people of Ukraine as a human shield to cover Johnson's misconduct. The reality is that under the parliamentary system of government in the UK, the support for Ukraine would not change with a change of PM. By attempting to link his continued tenure with the war in Ukraine, Johnson is trying to manipulate the public's perception of him as a strong and principled leader. However, his pattern of lawbreaking and contempt for democratic norms shows that he is not up to the task of providing the leadership that is required in this critical time. Clearly, the Ukraine war had become a game of power dynamics and image buildup for powerful nations. For example, Russia could have launched an attack on Ukraine already, but they didn't. What exactly stopped them? According to the experts, it has been suggested that China exerted pressure on Russia to delay its actions until the conclusion of the Beijing Olympics. China was concerned that potential military conflict would disrupt the Games, and it was crucial for China to uphold its global image. However, this hypothesis lacks concrete evidence, yet it is noteworthy that Putin explicitly mentioned the ambush in eastern Ukraine on February 21, the day after the Beijing Olympics ended. Coincidence? Who knows? Ukraine has undergone a severe impact on the country's economy, infrastructure, and citizens. Since the outbreak of hostilities in 2014, Ukraine has faced significant economic challenges, including a drop in GDP, a rise in inflation, and a sharp increase in public debt. There has been considerable damage to the country's infrastructure as a result of the war, including damage to roads, bridges, and airports, as well as power stations and water treatment plants. This has led to power outages and blackouts in many areas of the country, including the capital, Kyiv. The conflict has disrupted trade and investment in Ukraine, and many businesses have been forced to shut down. There are now more than 1.6 million people in Ukraine who have been forced to flee their homes because of the conflict. The war has had a major effect on the economy of Ukraine. According to the World Bank, Ukraine's economy had a lethal decline in the latter months of 2022. GDP fell by 34% in December after a 37% fall in November. The lives of ordinary Ukrainians have also been profoundly affected by the conflict. Many people have been forced to flee their homes, and the number of IDPs has continued to rise. Many schools and hospitals have been damaged or destroyed as a result of the conflict, which has severely disrupted educational and medical services. Many Ukrainians have experienced trauma and stress as a direct result of the conflict, and this has had a major impact on their mental health. Since February, Russia has been attacking Ukrainian cities with various weapons, resulting in tens of thousands of casualties. Citizens are forced to live under constant shelling and seek refuge in basements and bomb shelters. Evacuation from war zones in Ukraine is ongoing, but many locals are reluctant to leave their homes. There are no special places to move for longer periods, and temporary evacuation sites are often overcrowded with inadequate food. In late July, Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelensky announced mandatory evacuations due to problems with getting ready for winter in Donbas. The cold weather posed another challenge for residents of Ukraine, in addition to ongoing attacks from Russia. The country's food supply chains have also been heavily disrupted, leading to up to 30% of crop areas going unplanted or unharvested this year. Ukraine is a major food producer, supplying 10% of the world's grain and 13% of the global corn supply. The disruption of supply chains has caused a food crisis in several Ukrainian cities, which is part of the larger economic war triggered by the invasion. Small farmers need support to grow food this season, and green sustainable farming practices must be established for long-term food security. Moreover, the war in Ukraine has caused a significant number of casualties and losses, with the United Nations recording 8,317 civilians killed and 13,892 wounded. The Norwegian Chief of Defense estimates 30,000 people were killed from 24 February 2022 to 22 January 2023. US and European officials estimate 120,000 Ukrainian forces were killed or wounded, with ZSU accounting for 10,000 to 13,000 deaths. The Russian economy has suffered a 3 to 4% drop in GDP due to the invasion of Ukraine, which is less than the predicted 8 to 10%. However, recovery is not expected until at least 2024, and import substitution is regressive due to sanctions. Private investment is halted completely, and state investment is limited due to war financing. Brain drain has caused long-term losses estimated between 500,000 to 1 million. The Russian economy's pre-war potential of 2 to 3% growth per year has decreased to about 1%, and it will take 3 to 5 years to stabilize. Russian regular forces and Wagner troops are estimated to have suffered around 175,000 to 200,000 casualties, according to UK intelligence officials. Russia also lost nearly 40% of its tank fleet and missile cruiser Moskva, the flagship of the Russian Black Sea Fleet. Putin's spending on war material has increased, and he has been procuring kamikaze drones and missiles from Iran and North Korea. Russia lost its position of preeminence in the world due to the invasion of Ukraine. Evidently, it's no longer a superpower now. Every war bleeds the economy within, during, and afterward. The so-called special operations have resulted in massive casualties for Moscow's forces also, as Putin had to order a partial mobilization. Russia's financial sector is suffering from the impact of war and sanctions, limiting access to international financing and causing difficulty in payment transactions. In June 2022, Russia defaulted on external debt due to the sanctions, and net foreign direct investment inflows turned negative after the invasion of Ukraine. The loss of foreign direct investment is potentially one of the most devastating consequences of sanctions for the Russian economy. Exports to Russia are heavily restricted, with a focus on high-tech goods to weaken Russia's military production. Russian imports have contracted substantially due to the war and sanctions, with production in medium and high-tech industries contracting sharply. However, Russia's production structure is still dominated by low-tech resource-intensive industries, limiting the effect on total manufacturing production. Russia's GDP is forecasted to decline by 7 to 8% in 2023, similar to the major economic crisis of 1998 and 2008. This is due to unfavorable demographic trends, low investment rates, low productivity, and restricted access to foreign financing caused by war and sanctions. Apart from the loss of lives of Russian soldiers and mercenaries, there has been high inflation, a decline in living standards, and job losses. Many Russians have been forced to leave their homes in border areas, and the conflict has exacerbated tensions between ethnic Russians and other minorities. Additionally, the war has led to increased propaganda and censorship, with restrictions on media and internet freedom, limiting access to information and alternative viewpoints. There has also been a rise in hyper-nationalism and anti-Western sentiments, with dissent and criticism of the government being stifled. Overall, the war has had a profound effect on the social, economic, and political fabric of Russian society. Economic hardship and a migration catastrophe have resulted from Russia's invasion of Ukraine, which has created the worst war in Europe since World War II. After years of maintaining their official neutrality, Finland and Sweden are now pursuing membership in NATO as a result of this. The UN Refugee Agency estimates that 5.9 million Ukrainians have been uprooted from their homes within the country itself, and that nearly 8 million Ukrainians have sought refuge in neighboring countries and across Europe. According to the United Nations Agency for Children, roughly 2/3 of all children in Ukraine have been affected and have been forced to flee their homes. Since the war started, half of all Ukrainians have lost their jobs. Only 2% were able to find temporary earnings. It is crucial that investment in re-education and skills development will help improve this situation. Those that have left for other countries are willing to return home once it is safe to do so. In the meantime, if they could invest in their know-how and an increased sense of business culture, they could fuel Ukraine's economy after the war. The global economy has been affected by the disruption of grain and petroleum exports from Ukraine and Russia, two significant players in the global food and energy markets. Despite the pact mediated by Turkey and the UN last summer to allow Ukrainian grain to travel via Black Sea ports, Russia continues to impede imports of wheat, barley, maize, and cooking oil. This has led to shortages in countries such as Chad, Tunisia, and Sri Lanka, exacerbating existing supply chain issues and the effects of climate change on global food and energy markets. Ukraine's conflict has caused an unprecedented refugee crisis, with 8 million people displaced. Russia's military action has forced many to flee, straining resources and burdening neighboring countries. The crisis has resulted in a significant strain on hospitals and schools. The globe is realigning due to a conflict in Europe in the 21st century that is being led by nuclear power. It has roiled NATO, the EU, and the UN, pushing nations to choose sides and resulting in rising tensions and diplomatic reorientations. For instance, despite being a member of NATO, Turkey has expanded commerce with Russia since the beginning of the conflict and has raised concerns about admitting Sweden and Finland to the alliance. Russia is one of the largest producers of gasoline and oil in the world, and its oil, gas, and diesel have been banned in Europe, resulting in significant cost increases. However, thanks to conservation measures securing other supplies in a mild winter, prices have returned to pre-invasion levels. In response to the shortage of oil and gas caused by Russia's invasion of Ukraine, countries are imposing embargoes on Russian imports, working on contingency plans, and reducing dependence on Russian oil and gas, leading to a surge in gas and oil prices. However, the war in Ukraine could ultimately accelerate the global shift to green energy, as an investment in renewables is now considered a component of energy security and political stability, driven by the urgent need to reduce dependence on fossil fuels in the wake of the latest IPCC climate report. Russia is the nation with the most nuclear weapons. NATO has been significantly revitalized as a result of its assault on Ukraine, with the United States and other members sending tens of billions of dollars worth of military hardware there. Early armament supply included anti-tank missiles like the Javelin produced in the United States. The United States, Germany, and Britain have announced plans to provide cutting-edge tanks. What effect has this conflict had on world politics to this point? The war has brought to light the fragility of Europe's security, as well as the economic repercussions of Russia's loss of its primary oil and gas clients. Amidst this turmoil, Russia's strengthened ties with Iran, potentially involving the development of advanced weaponry, pose further concerns. Meanwhile, China stands to benefit from Russia's reliance on it for oil sales and geopolitical assistance, though it now has an ally in a weakened Russia. The political division in the U.S. regarding aid to Ukraine, coupled with President Biden's hesitation, risks prolonging the conflict and granting Putin additional power. To prevent further aggression, it is crucial to increase support for Ukraine and discourage China from acting aggressively toward Taiwan. While the Biden administration has taken some measures to address the situation, it may not be enough to effectively counter Putin's aggressive actions. The Ukraine war could potentially have been avoided through diplomatic means. The conflict has its roots in Ukraine's decision to pursue closer ties with the European Union, which was seen as a threat by Russia. If Russia had been willing to engage in negotiations and compromise with Ukraine, it is possible that the situation could have been resolved peacefully. However, the annexation of Crimea and the ongoing conflict in eastern Ukraine suggest that Russia was not willing to pursue a peaceful solution. Additionally, if the Western powers had been more cautious in their support for Ukraine, it is possible that the conflict could have been avoided or de-escalated. But as previously mentioned, the US and NATO could have signed a Ukraine non-NATO membership deal with Russia to avoid dire consequences. But they did not, and currently the West is not interested to avoid the war because they want to see Russia lose. So is really Russia losing it? The protracted and multifaceted conflict between Russia and Ukraine has proven calamitous for both parties. Russia's military capabilities have been revealed to be both barbarous and insufficient, with a series of setbacks including the withdrawal of a large troop contingent from Kherson, the deaths of numerous mobilized soldiers during an attack on Makivka, and the sinking of its flagship battle cruiser, the Moskva. President Putin's attempts to disassociate himself from these military blunders have only served to erode his authority, resulting in a reduction in international travel. Despite Russia's warnings, the West has elected to provide military aid to Ukraine, which has enabled significant progress against Russian-supported separatists in some areas. However, Russia has not relied solely on conventional warfare, employing disinformation campaigns and cyber attacks to destabilize Ukraine and advance its own regional interests. Moreover, Russia has repeatedly threatened to use nuclear weapons, which could have catastrophic repercussions for Ukraine and beyond. While the ultimate outcome of the conflict is uncertain, experts contend that Russia's objectives may be to prevent Ukraine from aligning more closely with the West or joining NATO. Consequently, Russia may regard this as a protracted ideological struggle rather than a conventional war with a definite victory or defeat. Within Russia, dissent is viewed as a severe menace, and those who speak out against the government or disseminate false information about the military face severe punishment. Meanwhile, the battle in Donbas persists, with Russia seeking to take control of the eastern city of Bakhmut while Ukrainian forces repel Russian bombardments to defend it. Ukraine fears that Moscow may be plotting to overthrow Moldova's pro-European government. Well, who should we blame then? The answer roots back to 1991. Following the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, NATO guaranteed Russia that it would not expand into Eastern Europe if Russia dissolved the Warsaw Pact. Despite these assurances, Russia grew suspicious of NATO's intentions, as the alliance commenced its eastward expansion towards the Kremlin's doorstep. NATO expanded its membership, attracting numerous former Soviet states such as Poland, Hungary, and the Czech Republic in 1999, followed by 7 additional former Soviet states in 2004, and now boasts 30 member countries under its purview as of 2020. NATO has viewed countries such as Ukraine, Georgia, Bosnia, and Herzegovina as potential members. However, NATO's trajectory has had a detrimental impact on Ukraine, causing unease in the Kremlin and ultimately leading to the ongoing invasion of Ukraine. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky erred in his assessment of Western support, leading Ukraine to bear the brunt of the conflict alone. The imposed sanctions by the United States and other countries will only exacerbate the already poisoned relationship between Moscow and the West, reinforcing Russia's determination to coerce Ukraine to sever ties with the West. Negotiating peace with Russia is likely to prove a daunting task for Ukraine, and NATO must heed this lesson. So, Ukraine has become a mere pawn in this war, with Joe Biden, Vladimir Putin, and NATO playing the roles of primary villains.
Thank you, President. 1 year on, as the war in Ukraine continues, when voices everywhere should be calling for a ceasefire and peace, this resolution is driving us in the opposite direction, so I proudly voted against it. It peddles the latest lie that this is not now about defending Ukraine, it's about Ukraine must win. What does that even mean? Last April, there was a deal on the table which would have seen Russia withdraw in return for Ukrainian non-NATO membership, but Ukraine's Western friends, killer clown Boris Johnson and NATO rocked into town and told them to keep fighting. The result? 6 cities devastated, 4 provinces illegally annexed, 108 billion euros in aid, which the people of Ukraine are going to have to pay back over decades, global food and energy crisis. Is this winning? Ordinary people don't win in wars. They're cannon fodder in the games of others. And ye can shout glory in here all you like, but there's no glory in the grave, and only graves come out of this folly.